Welcome back. This is going to be the second segment in our discussion on slavery, and I'm hopeful that you've already had a chance to go ahead and watch the previous segment that was talking to you about the Cotton Revolution. As you should know by now, what cotton did was expanded where you could see slavery being more and more profitable. It gave rise to a domestic slave trade. And over the course of time, it was one of the biggest forced migrations in human history. Hundreds of thousands, arguably even millions of African Americans from the Upper South were sold to the Lower South and were marched down there. It's not often that I can illuminate something in our class through the use of a story, but this happens to be one unique incident. One of the most famous books that was written in the 19th century was a book by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Many of you may know this book. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the book that she wrote in 1856, and it immediately became a bestseller, but it also became the Bible for the anti-slavery movement in America. To sum up what that book is about, it's about two things really. It's about how slave families are ripped apart from each other because of this domestic slave trade, and it talks about Tom, one of the main characters, being sold to the rural South. Tom is put on the auction block, and he's bought by an individual that is, for all intents and purposes, an aristocrat. He came from old money. His parents were rich. His parents' parents were rich, and he essentially bought Tom for his little girl. Well, to make a long story short, that family falls on hard times. In particular, both the father and the daughter of Tom's owners end up dying, and Tom once again finds himself on the auction block. Now, this time it doesn't have such a happy ending for him. Not only is he sold to the deep South, the Cotton South, Louisiana to be precise, but the individual that owns him is not an aristocrat in any sense of the word. He does not come from money. He does not. There's very little refinement to him. Let me explain exactly what I'm talking about. Whereas Tom was purchased before, more or less, as somebody that would be a companion for this daughter that we were talking about, this individual sees him as strictly as labor. In other words, he is one cog in the machine that produces cotton. So this guy that buys Tom in Louisiana does things like pry his mouth open to look at his teeth and, feel on his shoulders, and you can understand how invasive that might come across. Well, anyway, what happens to Tom is very emblematic of what's happening all across the American South during this period. Families being split apart and ultimately institutionalized human misery. Now, the individual that I told you about, that rich family that we were talking about just a second ago, they really were reflective of the slave-owning class in early American history. These are individuals that had come over to places like Maryland and Virginia much, much earlier than everybody else, and therefore they were able to claim not only a lot of land, but the best land. When they got here, slavery essentially made their fortunes, and tobacco, of course, but they were established. So at that point, they were able to focus on other things, including building these lavish, beautiful, but built on the backs of slaves, mansions, filling them with the finest arts, with the finest decor, with the finest furnishings. These were people that kind of prided themselves on the elegance of their culture, and for the most part what they tried to do was imitate the English nobility that they so keenly resented before they had emigrated to the United States. My point is, when you're talking about the planter elite, you're primarily talking about people that had inherited their slaves and their property from previous generations. And you're also talking about a particular type of slave owner that's probably located in the border states, Virginia, Kentucky, those individuals. The transition here, when we see cotton become king, is that more and more of these aristocratic slave owners are giving way to the enterprising slave owners. Now, I need you to understand something very directly. What you've got in the South is a slavocracy, and there's a lot of different ways that we can explain that, but there's really three important things that I want you to understand about that. Issue number one. The people that are calling the shots in the South, meaning the politicians and policymakers, they are slave owners, and obviously they're going to pass laws that would benefit them most directly. So slavocracy, the rule of slave owners. Issue number two, slavery was the lifeblood of the Southern economy. I mean, you take away slavery, and all of a sudden you take away a Southern economy. So you can understand what a huge commodity slaves occupied within this dynamic. Issue number three, and this is probably the most important with respect to slavocracy. What the system of slavery essentially did was create a lottery-like atmosphere. In other words, you're going to throw down $1 because you got to be in it to win it, the lottery, I mean. The idea was really simple with respect to that concept in the institution of slavery. If you could just get your hands on 1 or 2 slaves, then naturally those slaves would reproduce, and pretty soon you'd have a slave population, a growing one that is, of your own. So what you saw was people saving every last cent to their name and trying to do everything that they possibly could to preserve the institution of slavery and become a slave owner themselves. And the man that I was talking to you about, the guy that's looking at Tom's teeth and sizing him up, how well of a cotton farmer is this guy going to be, he's very reflective of the type of individuals that you're seeing emerge after the Cotton Revolution. The bottom line was, most Southern whites did not own even one slave. As a matter of fact, upon the eve of the Civil War, only 25% of Southern families had at least 1 slaves. So that begs the question, you can say that slavery is an institution that only benefits the rich, so why did 75% of the population, as Douglas has pointed out, that 75% is really being exploited, being hurt by this institution? Why did 75% go along with it? Well, it goes back to the whole idea of getting rich. Slavocracy had so shaped the customs and the social norms and the expectations and, most importantly, the culture of the pre-Civil War South that it convinced everyone that it might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but someday, and someday soon, hopefully, you would be a slave owner and you would need those laws to protect your financial and property interests. Now, I want to throw a few more numbers at you just so that you understand the nature of this institution that we're talking about. 5% of the wealthiest planters, the 5% of the richest people in the South, owned 50% of the slave population. So you can see a monopoly arising here on the horizon. Now, the middle class, meaning middling farmers, smaller time producers, on their best day, they probably represented anywhere from 10 to 20% of the population, and they owned approximately 40% of the slaves and produced 30% of the cotton. Now, for everybody else, what that meant was you're a small-time farmer, and if you're lucky, you own a little bit of land. You work on it, and for those individuals that were able to eventually purchase a slave, they probably worked right next to that slave. But my point is, you've got well over 50% of the population that's not only working like gangbusters, they're living in relatively impoverished conditions. Because one of the things that Slavocracy is producing is this really uniform, one-trick pony approach to the economy. What the South is essentially a banana republic. It produces raw materials for industrialized countries, including Great Britain, France, and more closer to home, the Massachusetts, New England area for the textile industry. So, what I'd like you to understand is this institution of slavery actually discouraged economic development and economic diversification. As a result of this, the North and the South are going to look much, much different. And I don't just mean that there are factories in Lowell, Massachusetts, and there's plantations in rural Alabama. What I mean is, when those immigrants start coming over from places like Ireland, Germany, later on places like Italy, Greece, Russia, they're not going to settle in the South because there are no jobs in the South. There are only rich people that have consolidated their wealth. They're going to be moving to the urban North. Now, there's one more dynamic in this that I'd like you to be mindful of, and that is the culture that emerges within the black community, the slave population. There were specific tactics, shall we say, that slaves used to survive. For instance, the institution of family was as important to the African American community as it was to any other community throughout human history. Well, it's also being destroyed. So, when people were shipped in from every part of the South, they began to refer to themselves as brother or sister or aunt or uncle, and you get the idea of people just latching on to other people, making them family, even though they weren't blood relatives. The other thing that slaves are desperately trying to do is hold on to some sort of racial ethnic identity. You have to understand that, for the most part, life is dictated to the slave, and so the idea of holding on to some of that heritage, some of that culture, is very important. I'm going to give you a couple examples. First of all, slave marriages. Now, there were instances where slaves were married by white ministers, but in some instances there would be slave ceremonies that would practice the old African custom of the couple jumping over a broom, or broom handle, I guess I should say, which would demonstrate to everybody that was witnessing it that these two were married. Now, this might sound like a really simple act and sort of a so what sort of situation, but you can clearly see that there are people that are trying to hang on to their identity. Gula, or Gullah, however you choose to pronounce it, was another way in which African Americans held on to some of their culture. Gullah was a language that was spoken by people of the western part of Africa, and although it doesn't survive necessarily intact, some of the grammatical structures of sentences, some of the dialects, African dialects, survived and become what we call today, what a lot of people call Black English, African American English. There are other ways to describe this too, but nonetheless it becomes very much a part of what the culture is emerging, or the culture that you're seeing emerge in the Black Belt. The last thing that I want to mention with respect to the African American world is the institution that the black churches occupy. Now, we've talked about this to some extent, but I want to reinforce it here. I need you to understand that during the Second Great Awakening, you see not only new Protestant churches emerging, a lot of those churches are organized by and organized for African Americans. We've talked about the AME Church. We also have talked about Bishop Richard Allen within that church. And it's not a coincidence that you're talking about an African American man that's taking a proactive role within religiosity. The black church was the only place in American life where people of African descent could not only have a little bit of control over their day-to-day life, but could also take a leadership role. So it should come as no surprise that when we get to the 20th century, the 1950s and the 1960s, the primary organizational base of what would become the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, people of that ilk, it's going to be in the black church. So what you're seeing here is essentially survival tactics, a way of surviving just the inhumanity of slavery. But at the same time, it's producing this very distinct culture within the Black South. And it's, again, what we can trace back to this whole notion of slavocracy.